So welcome back, and don't know about any of you, but
Yeah.
so how are you feeling after? And I know you've probably shared this before in many different environments. How was that for you, sharing that tonight?
I was a little bit nervous coming here tonight because I think I mentioned to Robyn, this is the first, I've spoken in this local area before, but not for as long as that. So I shared more of my story tonight. So I was nervous because this is the area I've lived in since I was 2. So I was a bit nervous, but it's always empowering after you've shared, especially in front of people where you can feel the warmth coming back. It's just, I feel good. Yeah.
And just on full disclosure, as I did with Mel's talk a couple of weeks ago, that I'd travelled around presenting suicide prevention programs, through an organisation called Enough is Enough, Ken Marslew. I did a number of trainings for Ken. A couple of those were in Berrima Women's Prison before it was closed back in 2011. And in 2017, I was also one of the external facilitators contracting to New South Wales Corrective Services, co-facilitating with corrective service facilitators with programs, domestic abuse programs. There were 4 different programs that were being facilitated, and I did that for 12 months. Areas, Bankstown, Sutherland, and one of the things, because I'm a great believer in if we knew better, we would do better. I'm also a great believer in my trainings, separate person from behaviour. For me, person is always okay. Behaviour can suck, technical term, but behaviour is learnt, and it can be unlearnt within a safe environment. And when I would hear some of the stories, especially with the corrective services programs, and the word that used to always eat away at me is when they called them criminals. And my heart would sink because words have energy, as you know. And you accuse someone of being a criminal. I would do my best to say, well, okay, maybe criminal behaviour, but even then, that's still but at least it's not defining the person by the behaviour per se. So with that sort of elaborate explanation, what's one of the key things now when you're working with the women that you do your best to unpack?
Yeah, with the women, we constantly remind them. We do a lot of one-on-one. It's myself and my colleague Juanita. We both have lived experience, and that automatically makes the women we work with feel comfortable. But we constantly remind them that this is something that happened. This is not them. And another statistic that you may not be aware of, that over 70% of women who end up in prison have experienced trauma, mental illness, domestic violence before they break the law. And a lot of women have assault charges because they've gone to protect themselves against the perpetrator of domestic violence, and they end up with an assault charge. So we constantly remind the women that what comes back on a police check is words on a bit of paper, and this is something that happened because of trauma that they've experienced. And, you know, to remind them that this is not them, it does not define them. And that's a big part of what we do in nearly every interaction. Yeah.
This is probably a good time to share a story from 2017 when it was the very first domestic abuse program that I was co-facilitating. Just so you know, the programs went for 10 weeks. They were 2 sessions a week, 2 hours per session. Yep, so 40-hour programs. What stood out for me was there was this one particular man, he was in his 50s, and yes, he was in there for domestic abuse. He shared the story that as a 5-year-old, his little mate, who was about the same age, was being abused at home, in his home. And let's just call the guy Joe that was in the program. And so Joe did his best to tell his parents what was happening, you know, as a 5-year-old. No one listened. So Joe and his little mate ran away because this was the only way that Joe, being a protector, could help his little mate. Of course, they were found, they were brought back. Joe did his best to share what was happening, to protect his little mate. Happened 3 times that they ran away, 3 times they were brought back. The 3rd time, and I could tear up with this because it's just like, how does this happen? So little Joe by now was 6 years old, and he was taken into child, what would it have been, custody? Child protection. Yeah, thank you. He ended up going into the foster system because supposedly his parents weren't able to keep him safe because he kept running away. He then started doing drugs, crime. So, you know, 30, 40 years later, when he's married, kids, and just as you weren't taught to know what you were feeling with your emotions, we don't teach our young boys to express their emotions. So you've got young Joe with all this trauma. I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong. But it was like, is it any wonder that Joe ended up in jail for domestic abuse? It's like we forget that the children that are in these environments grow up to do the behaviour, you know, the generational trauma. And I would imagine you've come across that so many times.
Oh, so many times. And I had, you know, my misperceptions and preconceived ideas of people that were incarcerated before I ended up there myself. And I remember sitting that first night in this cell in Silverwater, and that was you know, lights on 24/7, 3 cameras in the cell, and I was looking at the graffiti on the wall, and I just went, oh my gosh, these are just broken lives in here. Who am I to judge? That first night, was another eye-opener. I thought, this trauma on trauma. And you could see it on what the women had written on the wall, and
You know, one of my favourite tools as a trainer and facilitator was the DISC behavioural styles. 4 letters, 4 words. We all have all 4, we just have preferences. The S in DISC stands for the supporter. It's the person that's the team player, the carer and sharer. One of the things in a supporter behavioural style is the inability to say no. Because the supporter is unhappy when someone in the team, someone in the family is unhappy. And whenever I hear stories such as yours, I just go, that person's got a big chunk of the supporter in there, because saying no, it's like I'm going to hurt that person. And I know that's what I call the below the line behaviour, because it doesn't support ourselves and it doesn't support others. But when we start to understand this is handed down through generational trauma, does that make sense for you?
Oh.
That ability to not say no?
Oh, yeah. And couple that with the belief of unless you perform or do more, you're not worthy. It just,
Now, you've also shared your story twice, Parliament House.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit about that? Because that's a blowout.
Yeah. So there's an annual breakfast that's happened for the last 7 or 8 years called the Empowering Women, Changing Lives breakfast at New South Wales Parliament House, and it's hosted by the Keeping Women Out of Prison Coalition. And I spoke there twice. The second time I had longer to speak, and I shared a bit more of the first time it was the first time. I said how I was like many of the women in prison with a history of mental illness, a history of trauma and domestic violence, but I also had a long work history in education, and I said now I have a criminal record. And stated what the record was, and I was so scared because I thought, oh my gosh, I've never publicly said this. At Parliament House with 30 ministers of Parliament there, and I was holding my breath, and the whole room stood up, 300 people, and was applauding me. And that was a huge healing moment. I had the members of Parliament came up and said, you just broke our stereotype thoughts on, women in prison and, particular offences. And I thought, well, this is where the understanding has got to come. And my psychologist actually was invited to present to a whole lot of magistrates and judges in Sydney on what the impact of their sentencing had on the rest of a person's life. And I was one of 3 people that she used as an example without disclosing names or anything. And she told me their responses were of shock. They didn't realise the impact. And she explained to me it's because no one talks about it. So the psychologists don't talk to probation and parole officers or to the police or to the judges or to your lawyers. They don't talk. They each just do their own bit, so they don't get a full picture. And I thought, yeah, that's what people in the community do. They just look at the bit they want to look at. We sort of start looking at people in entirety and what they've been through, and to understand that why, not just look at the what and point the finger. Yeah.
There's a beautiful saying, every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. And I don't mean that in the biblical sense, but it's just so beautifully sums up, because we're all perfectly imperfect.
Yeah.
We're all flawed, we're all magnificent. Some of us just for some reason or other managed to not go to jail.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously. If every person thought back through their life and went, you know what, if there was a cop around that corner at that moment in time, you'd be hard pressed for very few people to go, yeah, you're right. How many people in this audience could actually say, I've never, ever done anything that... Can anyone? By the way, no hands went up. And speaking of all that, I was saying earlier, before we started the evening, I was channel flicking a few weeks ago and I came across Dr. Phil. And there was a woman, Karen Ruth Bass, an American politician and social worker. She was talking about, and she's a great advocate for assisting women who have been in prison and when they come out. She said the prison system was not set up for women. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, just even the physical building of the cells, is not set up for women. There's nothing rehabilitative about the physical setting, the way they treat you. You're never called by your name, you're called by a MIN number. Mine was 522475.
Sorry, say that again.
522475.
6 numbers.
Yeah. And you're always called by your surname. The term for the roll call when your cell door is open and before it's locked at night is called muster, which is dehumanising in itself. And I remember one day, one officer at muster called us all by our first name. And oh my goodness, you just went, oh, someone in this setting of authority called me Eleni. And it was so nice to hear. So nice to hear. And what woman doesn't like to be called by her name? You know, even that shows it's not geared up for women or for rehabilitation. Yeah, and they totally strip your identity away. Yeah.
But also a woman that has a baby in prison, how long do they, I mean, I couldn't even imagine actually anybody being born in prison.
Yeah.
Like, anyway.
Yeah.
So how long is she allowed to keep the baby with her in Australian
in the
prisons?
prisons I was at, they weren't. They had to, there was a special place in another prison for mothers and babies, but that had to wait till there was a bed there.
Right.
Available for her to be sent there. Over 60% of women that are incarcerated are mothers. So incarceration doesn't just impact the woman, it impacts the whole family. You know, even though my children were older, they're still your children, and they've got to go through that. My youngest was in year 12, and I just felt, I can't describe how I felt leaving him to do year 12 by himself when I'd supported the other two through there. And, you know, I got things in place with one particular teacher at his school that my son had a part in identifying as the teacher. I could tell what I was going through, so, you know, things could be set up to support him at school, and with the Board of Studies, let the Board of Studies know that there was this circumstance, because it did impact him, you know. But my kids have been my rock. And, you know, the judge, again, in his sentencing, said that's a credit to the kind of person I was. Again, he saw the character of me before, and this was out of character. So I had a fair judge. I really had a fair judge. And I knew I had to pay the price, and I accepted that. But to be continually hammered over it, you know, is not right for anybody.
And one of the things that Karen Bass said was, elections are won on being tough on crime rather than on prevention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty sad.
It is.
Especially in this day and age. Are we not better than that?
Yeah.
Really? Are we not better than that?
I learnt a term in prison. It's called corrective services, but the women said it's not corrective services, it's corruptive services. Because there's nothing rehabilitative about it. Yeah.
Another thing that Karen Bass said was addictions often begin with PTSD, postnatal depression, women being on prescription drugs, and then that leads to misusing non-prescription drugs, and they go into jail, and if they've got kids, the whole cycle starts again.
Yeah.
What do you think is a better system? If you had the magic wand, you were in charge, totally up to you, what would you do?
Having treatment in the community. Treatment for the why, not the behaviour, because that's what I got. I got that with a psychologist, and so many, before I was in this role, I worked with homeless ex-offenders in another role. Again, thankful to an employer that saw my skills and not my record. And I was holding a group session, and in the group of 10, there was about 7 men that were homeless, ex-offenders, all with drug charges, and had been in and out of rehab. And one of them said to me, you know, Eleni, I've been in and out of rehab a few times, and not once have I been asked why. And it's like treating the behaviour or the signs and the symptoms with a Band-Aid, and not getting to the bottom of it. Or you broke the law, let's incarcerate you. That's not solving anything. It's not making our communities safer. You're just putting them in jail and adding trauma on trauma that people, if they don't learn better coping mechanisms for their why, are just going to go back to what they know. So there has to be something better. And for the community to understand and support and not look at that record and support the person getting the treatment and not isolating. Isolation is a big part of mental illness and drug and alcohol addiction and shame. And by excluding because someone has a record, you've just added another layer of trauma on there. So stop. Like we've got to, if you had done, there was, I read something about a tribe in Africa, I can't remember what tribe it was, that when someone does something wrong, they put that person in the middle and surround, all the members of the community surround them by a circle and remind them of something beautiful they've done.
Yes.
Rather than the mistake.
Yep.
And I thought, wow, what a different world we would have if we did that in our society. Yeah.
There are so many questions that I would love to ask you, but my sense is to open up to the audience because I'm sure there's many, many, many. So we'll take a short break and we'll come back and do a Q&A with you in the audience.
Okay.
Thank you.